Well, welcome. Today we're going to talk about the new router. I am Paul Spears. I work here at Oasis Digital, and that's me, my email, Twitter. Before we get too far into this, I'm actually kind of curious. Is anyone actually using the new router yet? For anything real? Anyone using it at all? Even playing with it? All right. So that's got a real fresh group here. Excellent.
Anybody using the old router? Anybody using any router at all?
Define the old router.
All right, so first thing, what's it called and why is it called that? So up until recently, it's always been referred to as the new router, the new router, the new router, and finally they got around to creating an issue for it and saying, all right, we actually got to give this thing a name. And with the community kind of like bolstered and kind of led to the front was the name component router. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to it as a component router. Why component router? Well, the biggest idea behind this router is not so much the syntax or how it works, so much as the idea it's trying to convey. They're backporting more than just the code for the router 2.0. They're actually backporting the idea of routing two components in your application. The idea that your 2.0 applications are actually going to be clusters of visual components that you provide routes. So that idea is what we're actually bringing back here with the component router. And that's going to help us on our way to 2.0 if we're using the component router in a way that's akin to how it was originally intended. So, real quick, what we're going to do is we're actually going to run through the most simple steps that you can go through in setting up a router. And then when we're done with that, we're going to look into some heavier code that I've kind of put together, experimenting with it and seeing what it takes to actually put this guy in place. So I'm going to try real quick to get through these slides because I got some really cool stuff at the end that I want to get to. Hopefully we can get through it. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me though. All right, so first things first, where do we go and get this thing? Well, they have both an NPM and a Bower repo where you can go out and get Angular-new-router. So despite the fact that it's called the component router, they haven't quite gotten around to actually updating the versions for that everywhere. When I signed up for the talk, I'm like, you know, I know some things about the new router. I can learn a bit more and give a talk on that. One of the first things I discovered was that it was actually pulled from the 1.4 release. They kept promising that 1.4 is going to have the new router. It's going to have the new router. Component router coming in 1.4. And like days before the release, there's a little wee patch, like one line says, oh yeah, by the way, the component hierarchy router is not going to be in it. It's not quite finished. And that's very evident, as we're going to see. So, despite it being the component router, we get it using Angular-new-router, or you can compile it directly from source. You actually have two different options for this as well. You can grab it straight from the routers repo, or you can grab it out of the Angular 2.0 repo. And as of last night, anyway, the Angular 2.0 repo had more work towards the finished product than the router repository itself. All right, so once we have it downloaded, got plug it in, nothing surprising here. Include the source script, then you have to depend upon ng-new-router in your module. Pretty simple step. Now that we have access to it, the first thing we have to do is either create or identify some sort of application-level controller. So it's only recently have we started actually wrapping our entire application in a controller. We normally have each of our components have their own individual controller, and if there needs to be any kind of communication outside that channel, it goes through services or directives. Recently, though, we've actually been putting a controller around the entire thing. That's actually paying off for us because we actually need this for the new router. With your controller in place, we reject the router. $router is what you get from ng-new-router, and that's what we got to set up. So unlike the old router and UI router, you would actually set up both of those during the config block of your application. So you set it up once at the beginning, and what you had is what you had available. And this router, you actually set it up during the run phase of Angular. So you can actually add and remove routes dynamically from it, which is kind of a cool bonus. But with that in mind, where you set up your router matters. So the reason that we actually want an application level controller is because we want it at the highest point in our hierarchy, so that that controller is executed first. And as a result, all of our routes are then, our base routes at least, are all established for our application. If you try to put it, yes?
Did you do that just like in the run block? I
thought about that last night, like, I don't have time to try that out, but I would imagine you can. And that's probably the first thing I'm going to experiment putting in place, is seeing if I can get that done in the run block. So, yeah, you want it at the highest level controller that you can to make sure that those routes are instantiated before you try and execute other controllers around the application. All right, so now we have our application level controller and our router injected. We're going to go ahead and set that aside and go create a component. So this is the idea that we're kind of backporting. A lot of people have already kind of thought about this concept and have been applying it already, but it becomes very explicit in the code for a new router. So component consists of two things, a template and a controller. That's it. Pretty simple. But with using this router, your template must reside at the root of your application, /components, /name of the component, wherever you want to give it, /that name.html. Has to live there. Will not work any other way. Your controller must be named name my controller component controller. Will not work any other way. Got asterisks here. Talk about those later. So there is a way to get around this, but you're really swimming upstream if you have to go that route. So let's do that. That's what I create here. Create a component called home. I put the template for it at home.html. And likewise, it only makes sense to put my controller and JavaScript lives right next to it. This part right here for your JavaScript controller code is not needed. You can technically place this anywhere you want. What's important is the name of the controller for the JavaScript side of things. So here I've got my home controller. Let's see here. Here's the actual body of it. Something real simple. I'm just placing a message on it, just to make sure I got the plumbing right. And here I'm binding to that message. You notice I'm using the name of the component as the alias for the controller. So before you would have some sort of controller as statement somewhere in your code establishing that. Here, that's automatically inferred for you from the name of your component. So we have our component. Let's wrap to it. So now we're back in our
previous slide. So that function at the bottom is a constructor function. Is that right?
Right. So just like with controller as, this is a constructor function.
I'm shaking my head because it starts lowercase, and that really annoys me when a constructor function starts lowercase like that.
Yeah, and usually this is kind of a bad habit of mine that I just continue to use the JavaScript usual JavaScript identifier pattern. I think usually you see it in docs with the uppercase. So this is just this right here. I could have named my component with capital H, and then we'd have just had to have used that capital H here, here, and here as well. And so it's a trade-off of which do you like less? You're referring to a JavaScript identifier with a capital letter first, or do you like having your constructor functions with a capital letter first? Like, because you end up, this guy gets reused in various ways throughout the entire application. So it's which one do you hate less?
So in ES6, you'll probably write that as a class.
Right.
And then you'll have to tell your routing tool not to complain that your class starts lowercase.
Probably, yeah.
But, so can you name the function with the capital H and pass that function with the capital H to the controller and name the controller with the lowercase a?
Yeah, that's true. This right here is actually only used in the context of passing this particular function into my controller call.
Right.
So
and then the template is still in lowercase, right?
Right. So you could get around it that way.
Just making sure.
Good catch. All right. So let's route to this guy. So back in our application level controller, we're going to call $router.config, and that accepts an array of the routes that we're going to try and navigate to. And you kind of see a little bit of a similar syntax to the configuration blocks before. We supply a path, and for this case, I want slash to redirect to the only component I have. So it redirects to the /home path. Likewise, the /home path is associated with the home controller or home component. And this right here, this home right here, is what determined how I named this, where I got that, how I named my controller. So this one word, the name of my component, is what dictated how I wrote all of this. So we have a way to route to it. So now we got to add a viewport. Not to be confused with an Angular 2 viewport. Two completely different things. They're really ramping up for another NG block talk. They're really trying hard to make that happen. And so they've created something called a viewport, and they already have something in Angular 2 called a viewport, but these are not the same. So if you're digging into Angular 2, this may or may not be the same thing that you're thinking of. And for this before we had ng view or UI view, we have ng viewport. That's changing. Changing very soon, in fact. Soon it's going to actually be ng outlet that you use here. This is changing so soon, in fact, that if you use Bower install or npm install to go get this new router, you have to use ng viewport. If you grab it from the source and compile it, you got to use ng outlet. So that's how soon this is coming down the pipeline. So that's it. Congratulations. You have your new router set up. Woohoo! Let's go to the bar and grab a choice adult beverage. We earned it. But obviously, we still have a lot of things that we're usually missing from a real application here, such as resolve, event handlers, nested views, controller as. Let's take a look at resolve. We're going to add another component. I'm going to call this component user. You want to route to it by going to /user /some user ID. So if you use either of the other two routers, this syntax right here, you know exactly what that is. That's going to be a parameter for our router. Now, how can we navigate to this other than typing in the URL? Well, we have an ng link directive, which is a string that has the user or the component name, and if you have parameters, you actually execute this like a function and pass in the parameters in an object whose keys are your parameter names. So that's how you get at that. Clicking on that, this will actually be interpolated and then shown as a fully qualified path. So when you hover over it, it'll actually show down at the bottom that full URL space there. So you've got to add the actual component itself. So I created components user HTML. I just have a simple binding to the user component, username property. Where it comes from is not so much important. Just know that that's coming from data from somewhere. And then in our user controller, we are going to inject route params to get our routing parameters. And then a user service is going to be responsible for actually consuming the route parameters. So here I'm just saying, hey, user service, give me the user details. I'm passing in the ID from route params at this point. Using the promise there, that when it comes back, setting the property on the controller. So that's still not quite resolved. So what if we actually wanted this to be required? Like, I need you to have this fetched and available before you attempt to route. Well, here is one way you could do that. Here I'm saying, in my user controller, go ahead and instead of simply making this call and assigning the data in the then function, I'm actually storing the promise on the controller object that's associated with this call. And now we're going to use the new router's Lifecycle Hook functions. So we can actually extend our controller object by adding a CanDeactivate function. And this is what the new router will look at to determine whether or not you can route to this location. Yes?
All right, am I just dim, or does this seem like a giant step backwards? This looks a lot harder than the old result.
It did. If we have time, I've got something really cool that kind of lays this out in a different direction. I agree. At first, I was like, this is taking a lot of step backwards. But what I realized is that it actually feels less like step backwards and more like, here, we've actually given you more flexibility, but it's up to you to come up with the solution for your problem. So things like, can I go to this route based on some arbitrary set of data that's already in a scope? Or can I go to this route based upon some other random state in a service before you had a whole set of event handlers that you'd use to handle this and redirect accordingly? now you've got one spot. Choose what you need to do with it. Rather than try and find the right event handler, it's use promises here well, and you're in good shape. And I agree they could add some additional helpers that you might use to handle specific cases, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's coming. This right now is the biggest gripe point about the new router in the issue tracker. It's like, we don't have event handlers. We really need event handlers. And I've been kind of battling back and forth on the issue tracker saying, well, what are you trying to do? Well, you can do it this way. Well, what are you trying to do? You can do it this way. And it comes down to, do you want the API for the new router to handle all these cases for you, or you can learn the promises just a little bit better, and you can implement any solution that you need right here. So what ends up happening is, because we're actually extending the user controller, we actually have the same context for this available here as we did up here. So now when I say return this.data promise, I'm referring to the same data promise I stored up here, and I'm returning that as saying, if this resolves successfully, then that means you can activate this route. If it fails to resolve, then, or just never resolves or rejects, then it will not activate that route. But activating the route and running the controller are technically two different things now. So now, so long as I go to the route associated with this component, this controller block will always execute. But whether or not it will route to it and utilize the execution of that depends upon the return of this CanDeactivate function. So let's look at some more code. But before we drop out of this and kind of change gears to a different kind of project, any questions about this? Because this part right here is kind of what we're going to be talking about a lot. Yeah.
So with this CanDeactivate function, do you have dependency injection available?
You do.
Okay.
Yep.
What was the question?
With this right here, can we do dependency injection? We can. We're going to show how I simplified this and boil it down to kind of address some of the concerns we did and also taking advantage of that fact.
It occurred to me that people aren't terribly familiar with routing in general. They may not be familiar with what resolve currently does. Might be thinking.
Sure.
Exactly something like that.
So the idea behind resolve is, let's say you have a template, it's got all kinds of bindings on it, and those bindings are tied to some data that you're going to fetch from an async call. That's the most basic reason why you do this. But if you make that async call from your controller, what's going to happen is your view is going to instantiate, your controller is going to run, the temple's going to be showing up with these empty bindings until that async call finishes and populates your data. Then everything refreshes. That's a long-running call. Your users are going to be staring at a blank page or a partially complete page for the duration of that. With resolve, that will actually block the navigation of the application from one route to the next until all of the data points that you've put in that resolve function have had a chance to finish and succeed at executing a list of asynchronous calls that you provide. So you can have like 3 different data points that you need to fetch. You can list them out, and it won't route until they're all finished. And instead of seeing a blank page, you're going to see it hanging out on the old page until that's done, and then it moves wholesale from one complete page to the next. So that's a pretty big tool that a lot of people take advantage of. The resolve can also be used because of the fact that it will refuse to route them away from the previous route unless a successful promise is returned. People will also utilize it to handle things like, hey, I need to look at the parameters associated with this route that they've entered and verify that they've even entered in something correct, and if not, fail on routing, redirect somewhere else, etc. So you can get that kind of functionality out of it as well. Yeah.
Can you hop back a page where you injecting or using that one more?
This guy.
One more. All right. So for this path here, the module that's instantiating the home and user components, or you inject those still have to be injected into the module, the my app module, correct?
Right. So here, I've up above is actually where I've got my main app module. Like it's not actually on the screen here, but yes, I would still need to use dependency or a module dependencies there to say yes. I also need the whatever I call it, the my home module and the my user module.
So you'll see, or I've seen pretty often, where people will use the router inside of a config block for a module to do a standalone page that's reusable throughout multiple applications. So you can inject that one module and it'll create the route and stand up and hook into your application.
Right.
Can that be done through using this by just dropping into, I guess, the run block or the instantiation of the controller and that standalone component?
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay.
I've not tried it in practice, but that's the whole, one of the biggest reasons why they moved from, hey, let's actually put this in at runtime as opposed to config time. All right, so I've got a few minutes left. I'm going to try and show you guys some code. So I made a real simple app. Hold it up here. Yeah, I'm still setting up. So I made a real simple app just to play around with this. This is my Harry Potter wizardary, not wizardry. It's about wizards of Harry Potter. And what I started off doing was saying, I'm actually going to make this app using the old router first, and then go through the pain of converting it so I see what happens along the way. So I kind of applied the same kind of practices I would perform if I were ramping up to turn this into a real application. Just to walk you through this real quick so you have some context for what you're looking at. Really simple. You click Start here. Gives you a list of wizards. You sort through them. Find the one you want. Click on it. Here's some placeholder text. All done. That's all the application is. But you can see we're kind of taking advantage of a bunch of different async calls to fetch data, taking advantage of the route params up here. So got a little bit of stuff going on behind the hood, under the hood. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code. So this is my index.html. We already covered the basics where you set up your route by including it, and you establish a viewport. All right, we have established my application level controller. So we have the basics in place. Now, what's really interesting, and unfortunately I don't think you can see it that well, is actually my folder structure. How we normally set up our modules in our application and our files as well is similar to how we would set up a Java application. So I have my root level app, and inside that I've got my data services, my home component, I've got a wizard directory, which itself contains the wizard list and the wizard detail directory, which contain their own set of controllers and templates associated with just that piece of functionality. And this is pretty typical of how we would start to build an application. And I didn't want to have to rewrite my file structure and folder structure to make this conversion. So let's see what we have to do to actually make this work. Because before we said, if you have a component, it has to live at that component's folder. So I'm going to start by digging right into app.js. And here we have my main app module. And I have a config block. I've also got my app controller. This is inline function right here, where I use router config. Now before, this is where we supplied that array of all of the route objects. But what I've done is I've actually extracted that out and placed it down here, made it global to this IIFE block. So now, if you take this route list, put it straight in there, and I've cheated. There is no such thing as a template or controller property for router.config. But it doesn't use it, so it doesn't care. So I've kind of went ahead and augmented the route object a little bit for my own purposes later on. So if you need to use a component in some way other than that default manner, you need to establish how a controller is named and how a template is named. So the new router provides you with this component loader provider that you can use at config time by injecting component loader provider. And from there, you can call set controller name mapping. It takes a function, which takes a name. this name is your component name. So this guy's going to pass in the name for your component that you're trying to route to. You got to say, based on this name, what is the name of my controller? So if, for example, a lot of people will name their controllers, my component CTRL instead of the full word controller. Even that doesn't work unless you run it through something like this. So what I do, instead of making this long, complicated regex function that tries and maps this out or tries to figure out the nested structure of my application, I say, okay, here I'm taking advantage of Lodat to simply find some item in my route list that matches the name. So it actually refers back to the route list I created down here and grabs out the controller name. So essentially, I've recreated the old router route object list. And I'm manually making that association right here by saying, okay, for this route, for home, here's my controller. I explicitly state that rather than trying to figure it out on the fly. Likewise, with my template, I find the one with that name. I say, give me the template. So now this looks a whole lot like what we're used to with router configs. And now it doesn't matter where my components live, what they're called, as long as I make that, establish that relationship here, we're all set. One little caveat. The reason why I make this little defensive copy here is that when you pass this route list into config, it actually manipulates it and can munge it in a way that you actually don't have access to this component name anymore. So I just made a defensive copy, so that way they can have theirs, I can have mine, and we can both live happily. A lot of heavy stuff here. What do you guys think? Any questions? Plenty more to talk about, so I don't want to run off and you guys want to talk about this some more.
This is primarily something you do if you're converting all that to a
Yes,
if you're just doing this from scratch, you wouldn't necessarily know.
Yeah, if I were starting from scratch, I would just go with the advice, make a components folder, puke my hundreds of components that are actually going to be in an enterprise application into that one folder, and cry myself to sleep every night that I'm using the new router.
Yeah, did they learn their lesson the first time they were committed crap like that?
That is probably that is right up there with the there are no event handlers in terms of the amount of grief that they're getting.
Yeah, so Chris is not resisting nerves, and I resist earlier going, what? What?
Yeah, so I agree. It is complete garbage. And this is my way of saying, you know what, I'm just going to recreate the old routing look and feel and go about my merry way.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like, oh, just put all your controllers into one controllers.js file. Everything will be fine.
I'll figure out the answer. You just whispered in my ear. I'll let him say it. What do you think of the answer?
There has to be a reason for Angular 3.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's plenty of material for ngWatt 2, so they're also saving up for ngWatt 3 as well. So.
Yeah, Shai said he had 40 minutes of material. The other day, he had 15. So.
Yeah, there was a great thread. You guys should really go check out the if you want a good laugh, go look at the issue list for this router. It's chock full of stuff, so you're just going to start chuckling at. And Shai, yeah, he had some great quips in there about this stuff. So.
Can you show us the web page?
Yeah, the what page?
The web page of the issue list.
Yeah, I can bring that up.
So John Papa is on Angular 2 style guide, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is pretty violating his current style.
Absolutely.
So
Kind of, sort of. I've actually got an exact point to talk to you about that. So let's go take a look at my Wiz detail component here. So you were saying that isn't this a step backwards? But I think it's more of a step forward in moving away from controllers that don't exist in 2.0. So this is now what controllers with the new router, I think this is what they're going to boil down to when people start using this for real. So what we have is this guy's got to go fetch some data about the wizard I've selected. So I've got my controller, Wiz detail controller. Here I've named it, to make Mark a little happier, I've named it properly with a capital W. And the only thing I've put in my controller is an empty variable, then I went and leave off the semicolon, an empty variable that just is for the purpose of documentation more than anything, the fact that at some point in time, we're going to have access to some guy called wizard details. I then have my CanDeactivate log. It goes out and establishes some wizard details promise that saves it. And then it immediately returns that promise. because we don't want to be able to activate this route unless it succeeds. And then I use the activate lifecycle hook that runs once both of these have finished and succeeded. And here is where I actually move the bulk of my controller work. Again, because he's extending our actual controller using the prototype keyword there, we still have access to, we could have just said this.wizard details promise, but I cleaned it up a little bit by exposing that up at the top. And so now in here, this is where John Papa recommends an activate function at the end of your controller. So with that, you literally have an activate function attached to your controller. So you move all of that functionality in here. I think this is literally going to become a list of declarations of these are the things you'd expect to see on the scope. None of them are populated yet. Read on to see how that becomes the case. So this is something that I think is actually, I really like this. I stopped concerning myself about all the ways I've been threatened that I was going to get whipped if I did controllers the wrong way. If I stopped thinking about that, stopped worrying about that for a minute, think about just this as a pattern of here's what you have in a controller, here's what has to be fetched before you can use this controller, and here's what we do with the data once it all comes back and is populated, and here's how you actually establish your controller's data. I think this is actually a really nice pattern where it separates out all those concerns. It gives you nice chunks of each thing has a purpose, and here's where it lies. So going back to the what, these are actually broken if you try to inject scope instead of a watch right now. So, whatever. If you try to inject a scope right here, it actually can't instantiate your controller. The new router just falls over trying. So it's still got some work. But that is the state we're in today. We got it so that you can do quite a bit of really nifty stuff and start thinking about 2.0. But the only reason I would recommend using this today is if you know for a fact you're converting your app to 2.0 and you are okay with moving away from this ad hoc stuff that I've done and want to go ahead and identify your components, move them to that component folder, and start working ahead of where they're at now and be prepped for 2.0. But I would also wait until at the very least that they actually officially backport it, because I'm guessing a lot of those gripes that we've been talking about, no event handlers, no way to do, no official way to do a resolve, no official way to roll back a route that you can achieve with these. I think those are still coming down the pipeline. The inability to name your files and folders however you want. I'm guessing that they're going to keep getting that pushback there and eventually put it in. So my advice in general is just wait a little bit longer. Not quite there yet. If you are building an application from scratch today, then yeah, go ahead and take this guy out for a whirl. I think you're probably going to be happy with it, especially knowing that 2.0 is coming, and you don't have to deal with the headache of trying to map all your controllers and your templates. I think you're going to be in good shape trying to use it today, provided 2.0 actually ships. So that is all I have. Any more questions?
Is there any particular reason that you're not using ES6 classes here? Just not wanting to use transpiler?
If I'm not using ES6 classes, the reason being, yeah, I'm just not using a transpiler, and largely, if I've got an existing app like this, like we haven't made that full jump to ES6 yet. But just generically speaking, then a lot of people just haven't made that jump yet.
Because all the things you're doing with that WPC variable will just go away.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that actually points to another good reason why you should probably wait in terms of, I think you're probably going to be better off making that ES6 jump also, because that will ease over some of the pain and some of the what were they thinking, because like when you start using TypeScript, when you start using ES6, a lot more of this boilerplate falls away also.
Like you, I was surprised when they dropped this from 1.4. How close to really shipping are they?
Well, seeing as how they haven't even renamed the files and modules and controllers yet, I'm not hopeful for it to happen soon. But and especially considering that they've now stopped working on it in the actual router repo, they've gone back to doing work in the 2.0 repo, and like they need to rethink some things there before rethinking how they're going to backport it to 1.x.
There was, I think it actually came up on our internal book about, there was some concern that this may be evidence that all of the people that really are part of the project are busy on 2.0, and 1.x is not getting the love that we want it to. How much of an opportunity do you think there is here for just plain old people like us to get in and make a difference in how this router comes together?
I would like to say, yeah, there's all kinds of opportunity. I've been starting to make some noise on the issue list myself, and where my hope kind of starts to dwindle. I was talking to Kyle about this. There's actually an issue out there that is pretty much like pinging the Angular team, like, are you guys still around? And it's got like 2 months of discussion from nothing but community members with not a single comment from the Google team itself. So that doesn't have me that hope. And so, yeah, it would be great. We could do all kinds of stuff with it if we could ever get a hold of anyone to actually do something with it. And I think, yeah, their biggest concern is that they're not interested in improving a 1.x backport of something that started in 2.0. Like they are trying to figure out how to make the 2.0 thing work and then backport it. And
well, I'm sure they are concerned about it, but it's there's 500 hours a day. So.
Right, and we're not going to see them accepting forks and pull requests for a 1.x path of things. I don't think. Like they're going to be forward thinking that you need to find a way to write this in ES6 and in TypeScript that is compatible with 2.0 that successfully manages to make that trek back to the 1.x branch. So anyone contributing, they're probably not going to go anywhere unless they come up with that solution that works both ways. And that's just what I'm seeing from what they actually latch onto and run forward with from the community. So yeah, there's still plenty of it, but you got to be deep in the TypeScript and ES6 and the 2.0 code base before you're probably going to get too far.
I'm going to pull up that website.
Yeah. So Kyle requested that I
That issue is
pull that up. So that is at GitHub.
Everything is a GitHub.
Angular/router. Jeez. Yeah, so got more open than closed right now. And just all kinds of stuff that you expect to be solved. Oh, something I forgot to mention entirely. Nested routes and sibling routes. It actually comes in the box with sibling routes. You can have any number of them, and you just kind of change the way you declare those routes by specifying that sibling A and sibling, or component A, component B, map to viewport A and viewport B. So you got to kind of name some parameters there. But nested routes, they're like, oh yeah, you can go to nested views. That's not a problem. And people are opening up issue trackers like, no, it doesn't work. See, like, yeah, it does. It works. So a couple rounds later, like, yeah, that doesn't work. We meant to have that in there, but it's not there yet. So that's another area where we got a little bit of work yet before we can get some nested views in place.
I learned a lot from this presentation, Paul, but most of what I've learned is that I'm giving my students really good advice, which is stick with the current router unless you need like things that only UI router can provide you today.
Yeah.
Stick with what you've got, because this is not enough.
Yep. But I think if you take anything away from this, the thing I think is most important is starting to think about your applications in terms of components, what they're composed of, and how you can just drive those to isolation as best as you possibly can. Because regardless of how this ends up, that's what's going to get sucked in from 2.0. So if you look skeptical.
No, I'm just reading something. These are great. URL change even if CanDeactivate returns false. So that's broken. And that one's
Okay, well that's broken. Yeah.
Mail to links are recognized as component routes. That seems bad.
Yeah.
So I've got a question about.
Here we go. This is the one I was referring to. So it's only 20 days. But if you look through here, like there's no one. Yeah, like, hey guys, anyone there? Yeah, nothing.
So in the case of the CanDeactivate, how often is that called? Like I know obviously it's going to be called whenever you click to go to that link. But if you ever resolve that happens to take a long time. You have, say, a static header or something with some links on there. The user gets impatient to start spam clicking everything. Can that CanDeactivate be triggered multiple times then for the same route?
So like if you're like start refreshing the page, trying to get it to go.
Yeah, something
I
like
would assume so. I mean, that's how it works now, I believe.
So the only thing I'm worried about then is with that example where you had it cleaned up a little bit nicer, does that then mean that promise is going to be triggered? There's going to be multiple instances of that promise?
I'm not sure how the garbage collection would work there. I would assume that the old promise gets destroyed when the page refreshes.
Well, yeah, so if you have, like, say, a static header and your home page has resolved, and your header has your home page on it, and they click to go to your home page, it's taking a long time for some reason, so they just start spam clicking the home button.
Oh, yeah, for clicking the home button, yeah, and I think
it's not actually triggering a refresh.
with that, like, if you want to actively protect against that, because I think that's actually true of any resolve and any of the other mechanisms now. That's all, if you keep spamming it, that's going to happen. I think you're better suited to take advantage of the other lifecycle hooks we didn't discuss, such as CanDeactivate and deactivate. So you could actually only fire that process off like for some of those data. Like if you have like one really big thing that you don't want to fire off unless you're really sure you're going to land on that route, you can put it on a CanDeactivate, and that will only happen as it tries to navigate away, or like some combination there. I'm not sure exactly, but there are lifecycle hooks I think we could utilize there to achieve what you're trying to do.
Because the controller's not going to be reinstantiated every time they click on it. Because that should have already been taken care of.
Every time they click on it, no, and probably even
every time they
activate, probably, but every refresh,
yeah,
or to reroute. Yes.
The controller itself would be instantiated. So the first example you showed in your slides had it to where it creates the promise and starts resolving it.
Right.
So whenever that controller created from the initial click, it would create the promise and start resolving. And then each trigger to CanDeactivate after that would trigger off the same promise that already been created.
Right.
But in your second example you showed on it, it's actually recreating that promise every time. So it's another hit to the API if CanDeactivate is actually recalled every time instead of.
Well, I think that anytime CanDeactivate would be called, you're probably looking at another controller reinstantiation anyway. I don't think those two are separated in terms of like, can you somehow call one without the other? So I think no matter where you create it, like anytime you trigger that actual edge of I'm going to try and go to this route, both of those are going to hit every time. So what you would probably want to do then instead is in your deactivate, start your request then, store the promise on service in your controller or in your activate, pull down that promise out of that service. Are you done yet? Okay, return it. Here you go. You can activate. So get it on the way out the door instead of the way in the door, and then cache that promise. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I can tell you one of the things that I've done in my Angular 1.x apps is I've moved heavily toward practically everything's a directive.
Right.
Even at the feature level of the application. So it's directives all the way down.
Sure.
And I had hoped that this component router would really let me finally embrace that, so that I was kind of routing to these feature level directives. And it looks like they're almost there, but I now have to have a template and a controller. I already have those things inside of a directive. Can I route straight to a directive, or do I really still have to wrap this thing up? Like at this point, my use of ng-route is these very thin routes that essentially go to this template that is this directive. Can I do that with the component router?
Not that I've seen. Yeah, I've not seen it anywhere yet.
Yeah,
but yeah, I see plenty directives are obviously broken because half of these refer to something about directives. But I would expect that the biggest hang-up for that is just the vast difference between Angular 2 directives and our directives.
Yeah. I would say that it makes sense that they did it this way, given what you see about Angular 2 components. But.
Yeah, and I get that, but that just means this router is really not appropriate for 1.x.
Yeah.
And for what I think the best way that has kind of emerged from in practice is for building 1.x applications. I don't think this router is really appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have enough experience with it yet to say definitively that's the case, but I'm getting the feeling that is the case.
Yeah, for enterprise solutions, this is not ready.
Yeah. I walked in wanting the same. Sorry. I was just gonna say I walked in wanting the same router that you want. So maybe we should talk about.
I was gonna say I think there's a possibility here. What do we call our stuff? The build, load, map off the ball.
Yeah,
the ball router.
That could be abandoned.
Exactly. We'll end that just as soon as we possibly can. Because it's the angular way.
It's already abandoned.
We're so cynical. We're also cynical.
All right, guys, thanks.
Thank you.